Hey everyone, before we jump into today's conversation, we want to ask for your help. Here's the deal. Producing Faithful Politics isn't easy. We're entirely self-funded, meaning we don't collect a paycheck for the work we do. That means we rely on people like you, our listeners, and our audience to keep this podcast going. So if you believe in what we're doing, we're asking you to consider supporting us.
And here's why it matters. Let's face it, most of the media today runs on conflict and drama. You've heard me say this before. If you can control people's fears, you can control them. The louder and more polarizing you are, the more attention you get. But we here at Faithful Politics are committed to something different. Conversations that are thoughtful, nuanced, and respectful. Unfortunately, those kind of conversations don't get rewarded in today's media landscape.
So if you value substance over spectacle and civility over chaos, we'd love to get your support. There's a link in the show notes where you can easily give $5, $10, or even $1,000. Big or small, it all helps. You can even do it while you're listening to this episode. Together, we can show that meaningful dialogue still has a place in our culture. Thank you so much for considering, and hope you enjoyed the show.
As a whole, the vast majority of Trump voters are not actually evangelicals in this sense. Like when you take that, there was a number that went around for years from the 2016 election that 81 million evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. When Barna dug into those numbers and started to break it down according to church attendance, the more you went to church, the less likely you were to have actually voted for Donald Trump. So 4 times a month churchgoers supported him at a rate that was more, I think it was more around 50% or high 40s even maybe. And so it was more about kind of the social, cultural identification with evangelicalism. Those folks voted for him in very, very high numbers. And I think that matters. I mean, it matters in the conversation because, we still have an enormous number of Americans who are just sitting out these elections and just uninterested in politics. They're busy with other things.
Hi there, Faithful Politics listeners and viewers. If you're joining us on YouTube, thanks for being here. Also, if you're joining us on YouTube, make sure you like and subscribe. Hit the notification bell. I need one of those cool things that shows up when I point at it, Will. Can you make that happen? Point here. And then we're super happy that you guys have joined us. I'm Josh Bertram. I'm your faithful co-host, and of course we have our political co-host with us, Will. It's good to see you, Will.
Yeah, it's good to be seen. Thanks, Josh.
And today we have the pleasure of interviewing Mike Cosper. He has been creating music, radio shows, and podcasts for more than 20 years. He produced and hosted the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill podcast and is the director of podcast of Christianity Today. He now co-hosts a weekly podcast called The Bulletin. Cosper also leads cohorts for church leaders and is the author of 6 books, including his latest, The Church in Dark Times, Understanding and Resisting the Evil That Seduced the Evangelical Movement, which we'll be talking about today, and all sorts of other things that we get into. Mike, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me on. It's good to meet you guys, and I appreciate being here.
Absolutely, man. The pleasure is all ours. And so I got to ask you a question to start. This is going to be a softball, but I heard a little birdie on the street said you were a shepherd for sale. And I just wondering, how much do you cost?
Oh man.
To get you to say whatever I want. Now, what are you a shepherd for sale? What's going on with that?
I'm trying to remember. I think maybe it was Nick Cave who once said, people keep accusing me of selling out, but somehow the check never clears. So I'm definitely in that position. If I've sold out, I don't know why I'm still in debt. And it's a frustrating thing,
good.
To be honest with you.
That's really good. Well, man, I got to ask, so what's it like being the director of podcasts at Christianity Today? Maybe, plug some of your podcasts and what's going on there. Mm-hmm. It's exciting stuff at Christianity Today. I'd love for you to kind of introduce our audience to that. And what you guys are doing. Yeah,
so I've been here 5 years. It'll be 5 years in February. It's funny. I'm remote. A lot of our staff is remote. I joined in February of 2020, which means that the first staff quarterly, the first time I met my coworkers face to face, was on March 11th. March 12th was the first day of the shutdown. And so we
That's
flew
wild.
home on March 12th. I walked, and I didn't see those people again for almost 2 years. I mean, I'll never forget walking through O'Hare that night. It was a ghost town. I maybe saw 12 people in the entire airport. There were 4 people on our plane. The only reason they didn't cancel the flight was that it was a Louisville crew and they were going back home for themselves. They put us all in first class, and the world shut down. CT's been on a journey the last number of years. It's been on a transformation, rebranding, new initiatives, new people, new ideas. A couple things that I would point to is, the Bulletin, I think, is a show that listeners to this show would probably like a lot as well. Sort of an evangelical perspective on news and events. I have a podcast launching here in a few weeks called The Devil in the Deep Blue Sea. And this is going to be an ongoing series where each season we kind of pick a story, kind of like Mars Hill, like we pick a big story and tell it over a series of episodes. The first season is going to be about the Satanic Panic of the 1980s and the parallels between the panic and other political and social dynamics of the period. We've got a show coming from Christine DeClario, who's a really brilliant musician, artist, singer, probably like one of the most influential Christian artists in Latin America. And she's doing a show about mental health and trying to help people get through the stigma of mental health. I'm really excited about that show. I think it's going to really help people. And then people who are interested in things like spiritual formation, soul care, that sort of thing, they should check out this Steve Cuss's show, Being Human, which is just, it's my favorite podcast. I mean, every episode you just feel like you're sitting and you're getting therapy from Steve, and it's very healing. It's very good.
That's really awesome. Yeah, I bet the Satanic Panic one would be really, really good. We just spoke with a professor, Joseph Latecock. I think that's his last name, but he wrote a whole book about Satanic Panic, and we had talked to him about that whole, like, I don't know, period in time. He equated it to sort of QAnon, and it was just super, super fascinating. But I want to talk a little bit about, kind of tongue in cheek, like, we asked if you were shepherd for sale. It was sort of tongue in cheek, but like for those that aren't following the latest and greatest of, beating up on Mike Cosper on Twitter, like people accusing you of being a shepherd for sale, kind of has like some bit of an origin story, I think, and I think that your book probably is one, if not the reason why I think a lot of folks on the far right are really kind of going after you. So maybe tell us a little bit about your book, and why did you choose to write it?
Yeah, so the book is called The Church in Dark Times, and the title itself is a reference to a book by Hannah Arendt called Men in Dark Times, which was about is a series of portraits or a series of profiles, basically, of a number of men who, during the Second World War, showed unique courage, or in different historical circumstances, most of them in the Second World War, showed unique courage when the sort of tide of the moment, the current of the moment, was gravitating towards some very evil and dark stuff. I got interested in this project because I've been an Arendt reader for 25 years. I discovered her in college and just kind of fell in love with the way she thinks and the way she sees the world. And then I came back to her when I was honestly when I first started thinking about her, when I first started seeing some of the crisis of leadership in evangelicalism around 2010, 2011, when you saw the first signs of problems in Driscoll's church. I saw the first signs in my church. We went through a very similar situation to the Mars Hill story. And which, for those who aren't familiar with, Mars Hill was a church of, over a period of 20 years, grew to almost 15,000 people in 15 locations around the country, and was mired in controversy for its last year. The pastor stepped down, Mark Driscoll stepped down, and the church basically disappeared overnight. And so the podcast, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, was just telling that story and trying to understand it. This book is sort of the next layer of trying to understand it. People are asking, why does this keep happening? Because there's so many stories that are similar to Driscoll. And I found Arendt's thoughts about movements, social and political movements, totalitarian movements in particular, how those happen, how people get caught up in incredibly evil societies, good people, and I found her thoughts extremely illuminating. And, her biography is a big part of it as well, because, the people who turned against the Jews in Germany were the elites, and she was among them. And so for her, that whole story was that whole history was a betrayal as well. She had to flee for her life a couple different times. And so the book's a bit of a dialogue with some of her ideas, and really trying to then interpret how has the evangelical movement become complicit in so many dark things.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
All right, we'll get back into the conversation in just a moment, but we wanted to take a break and share something really special. One of the best parts about this podcast is hearing from you, our listeners. Your comments, feedback, and support remind us why we do this.
Absolutely. We've got a couple of listener comments here that we wanted to highlight. For example, a listener from Greenville, South Carolina wrote, "Thank you so much for your shows. They help me feel seen. Truly, your friendship and humility is encouraging." And then a listener from Ohio said, "Josh and Will do an incredible job touching the challenging issues of religion and politics. You can agree to disagree and still love. Josh and Will are testimony to this, as they are on opposite sides of the political divide, but are the best of friends. You won't be disappointed."
I'm pretty sure my mom wrote that one, by the way. There's also this comment from Nick. "Of numerous podcasts I have listened to that purport to give an objective view of politics and religion, this one comes the closest. A staunch Trump supporter might disagree with me, as this podcast is not a home to the ex-president's sycophants. Yet, right-leaning co-host Pastor Josh faithfully articulates concerns from the right side of the aisle, and by the host's accounting, their listeners come from across the political spectrum. Left-leaning co-host Will Wright, for his part, has read and digested the fine print of the political documents he brings up, an important service to listeners. Seriously, it's comments like these that keep us going. And if you've been enjoying the show and want to help us continue, here's how you can support us. In the notes, there's a link that will allow you to leave a donation and a note. Whether it's big or small, every bit helps, and every bit keeps us going in the work that we're doing."
And who knows, if you leave us a comment or message, we might just read it on the air on a future episode. So yeah, give us a donation, give us some comments, let us know what you think about it. And the biggest thing is just thank you for being a part of this journey with us. Now, back to the show.
Man, that's so interesting to me. I've heard of Arendt. Is that how you say it? I've heard of her name a few times and have not really gotten into reading her works. And now you got me really interested and thinking like, hey, man, I probably ought to read this person, because it probably sounds like she'd be very, very insightful, and the kind of thing I would like. And I'm thinking about the basic idea behind your book, trying to kind of figure out what's going on in the evangelical church right now. And in your first chapter, you talk about exchanging the truth for a lie. And what are, like, I would love for you to kind of give us a sense of what you mean by that. Like, what is this truth? What is the lie that it's being exchanged for? And what is this intentional? Is this unintentional? Like, what's going on here in your research and your way of thinking that is that's causing this exchange that we're seeing going on?
Yeah, so there's a real specific example that I go into in that chapter that I think is probably worth mentioning. So there was a guy at Mars Hill, his name's Paul Petrie, and by all accounts, up until 2007, he was one of the bulwarks of the church, just one of the most beloved pastors. This was the guy all the pastors went to for marriage advice, family advice, parenting advice, whatever situations you ran into. And Mars Hill came to this crossroads where Driscoll and some of the other elders were proposing a change to the polity, a change to the way the church governed. And what it did is it really centralized power around Mark. It really disempowered the elders as a whole. Paul was a lawyer. Paul was older than everybody else. He'd been around the block a few times. So he saw this and thought, there's a lot of problems with this. Like, not only is this bad for the church, I actually think this is bad for Mark. I think this puts him in a position where he lacks healthy accountability that is really good for his soul. So he, expressed some discomfort with it. Driscoll reacted severely enough to fire him and to, essentially say, we're going to kick you off the elder board. Turned into this big conflict, this big controversy. And every elder in the church, except for one who was with Paul in the concerns, every elder but one voted to strip him of his job, strip him of his eldership, and ultimately to kick him out of the church. And this ruined Paul's life. It ruined his life. It ruined his wife's life. It ruined their families' lives. Like, they were deeply enmeshed in Mars Hill, and it was this incredibly abusive and destructive act. So I tell that story a bit, and I talk about what interests me for the book is not Driscoll, because it's hard to know exactly why Driscoll is the way he is and does the things that he does, but those 22 elders who most of whom came around in later years, after the church closed its doors, and apologized to Paul and said, we made the wrong choice. Like, we shouldn't have done it. We should have seen it. It was plain as day that we were doing the wrong thing. How does that happen? How do we get to that place? And the answer to that is a long story. If I had to center it on just a couple of ideas, I would say the answer is that we live in a cultural moment that's very strange, and that is primarily marked by a deep and profound loneliness. And what happens to incredibly lonely people who don't have a sense of identity, who don't have a sense of belonging, they're deeply susceptible to somebody who comes along and says, I have a story for you. I have a place for you. I have a wonderful plan for your life, right? And we end up getting caught up in sort of the movement of these folks. And sometimes they're totalitarians, sometimes they're cult leaders, sometimes they're evangelical megachurch pastors. And the danger of it is that once you get caught up in this story that's giving you all this meaning and all this purpose, there's a gravity to that bends us morally in really dangerous directions.
I didn't grow up in the church. I came to the faith in 2008. And prior to that, spent most of my time on the West Coast, with all my other fellow heathens and liberals out that way. So I don't necessarily have any really good frame of reference to kind of understand, systematic corruption, no accountability, what have you, in kind of the church. So like, I'm curious, like, is what you're seeing in, whether the Mars Hill Church or just sort of, the Big C Church kind of as a whole, like, is this something that is just coming out of nowhere? Or has this just been kind of a gradual erosion of, the integrity of the church over time?
Yeah, I think it's been gradual. What's the F. Scott Fitzgerald line about how did you go bankrupt? Slowly then suddenly, something like that. Like, I think there's been a gradual thing, and I think you can point to two big things that have transformed the culture of the church. One is one is sort of the erosion of the power of denominations. Or you could even put it this way, like, the problem is the institutions, right? So we don't have great formative institutions right now in evangelicalism. And maybe we never did. Our movement's pretty young. Protestant institutions, if you sort of look at the history of them, once you have the sort of fundamentalism, liberalism divide, and most of the mainline institutions go in the direction of liberalism and sort of deconstruction of doctrine and dogma and all the rest. Once that happens, the church has really struggled to create strong formative institutions that not only sort of preserve doctrine, which is what evangelicals have been mostly concerned with, and fundamentalists have been mostly concerned with, but have figured out how to form and shape character in meaningful ways. So that story is a long story, that maybe goes all the way back to the Protestant Reformation. I mean, Charles Taylor would say it goes all the way to the Reformation. The other issue that I think we have, and one more thought on that. So what happens as a result of that is, because we don't have this great history and we don't have these strong formative institutions, we don't have a bigger story that serves as sort of guardrails to grandiosity. Like in the Catholic Church, and clearly the Catholic Church has its own problems, and that's another whole conversation. But no single Catholic parish, I mean, I shouldn't say none, but it's much, much more rare for a single Catholic parish to get the kinds of delusions of grandeur that mark the North American megachurch, where it's like, hey, we're going to change the world, from right here in our little, hovel in suburban Chicago. Because they've got this larger story that they're a part of, because they're dwarfed by their story. Every parish is, no matter how big they are. So I think that's one problem for us. I think the other problem for us that emerges in the 20th century is just the power of celebrity. We don't know how to protect ourselves from the way that celebrity can be corrupting. Billy Graham figured out how to do that, but it's almost as though like Billy Graham had he had an insight or a self-awareness. I don't know what it was, but I always sort of compare and contrast the difference between Graham and Robert Schuller. Graham built an institution that would insulate and protect him from his own vices, and he submitted himself to it. Schuller built an institution that overwhelmed his denomination. So when he started to become larger than the denomination, when he started to drift theologically and abandon some of the principles of his denomination, there was nothing they could do to him, because he would have overwhelmed them in the public sphere had they actually initiated any kind of conflict with him. And so we still haven't figured that out. Success makes you famous, and fame, it's a dangerous drug.
Man, that's really convicting. I started a church 5 years ago, and I definitely had I guess delusions of grandeur. Mm-hmm. I wanted it to be huge, even though the way that I was doing it was very relational and discipleship driven. I still had this sense like it's going to get, huge. It's what I want. And there's that part of me that still wants that, for sure. And I for sure want growth. And I work pretty closely with some pastors of, mega churches, that would be considered. And I see them in their lives, and, I respect them. And yet I know that at the same time, the danger for all of us is that there would be this sense that we're so big. Like you said, success is so much, even this podcast. I mean, we want it to grow. We want it to reach as many people as it can. What happens when if it gets so big that then do we start feeling pressure? Like we can't shift our attitudes. We can't shift our mind. We can't, come to a different decision. We can't really think differently or critically, or we feel this pressure because you have to keep the subscribers and you have to keep, the views and everything coming in. And it's definitely a pressure already that I know I feel, I think Will feels. And how do we work through that? This desire for, hey, we want this. Like I'm sure you wanted the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill to be successful and to reach people. That's why you made it. You didn't put all that much work into it so that like 5 people would listen to it and 3 of them would think it was amazing and the other 2 would send you hate mail. Right. So what?
And those 3 people were like my mom and my yes. my cousin.
Wait, your mom listens to your podcast? Like that's an achievement.
My mom doesn't. But all that to say, like, and I think I've said enough about the question. But how do you wrestle with it? Mm-hmm. How do you feel like we should be? Because I hear what you're saying, and I agree with it. It's very compelling. And yet I'm trying to figure out how to wrestle with it.
Yeah, I think to a large extent, it comes back to the story we're trying to tell ourselves about why we're doing what we're doing, right? If you're telling yourself a story in which you say, I want to reach a lot of people because I think this matters, and whether it's a church or a media project or whatever, there's an extent to which I think that's not just fine, it's important. Like, if you don't think what you're doing matters, don't do it. You know what I mean? Like, go if you can. It's like Rainer Maria Rilke in his Letters to a Young Poet. He tells the kid, he says, look, if you can imagine yourself doing anything else with your life other than trying to be a poet, you probably should, because this is a miserable life and it's very hard to make a living. Go do something else. That's really true of, I think, any creative endeavor. And it's true of church planting. I mean, I know church planting from the inside. It's miserable. It's hard. And if you could do something else, you probably should do something else. But if you're burdened to do it, then you need to do it, and you shouldn't be ashamed of that. The problem comes in when you start telling yourself a story in which you become indispensable, right? Once we start saying, as leaders in particular, once leaders start saying to themselves, God is doing something through me, and I need to ensure that I'm protected and safe, that I get to do what I want, because the mission is dependent on me in some way or shape or form. That's the thing that marks all of these abusive systems. And part of the point that I'm making in The Church in Dark Times is this idea that when what we see the church doing in this way, we see happening in politics in all kinds of ways around the world and around in history. This idea of the great man, the indispensable person, it's incredible. It's a recipe for an enormous amount of destruction.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because I think that as Christians, I don't know if primed is the word, but like we're all kind of primed to respect the man that the New Testament points to, of Jesus, this powerful figure, humble, whatnot. And so like we kind of create this bit of a template. We're like, okay, it's a man. A lot of people like him. Who do we know in society that is a man? And a lot of people like, and then we kind of like, project all of the sort of worship that we normally would save or should reserve for like Jesus onto this other type of figure. So like, I'm curious, like how much of that do you think kind of comes into play? And is that part of the evil that we have to kind of resist, especially within the evangelical movement?
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and that's a tale as old as time, right? I mean, that's 1 Samuel. Israel looked around and they were upset because everybody else had a king and they didn't have a king, and they wanted to be, see someone embodied, and and God's like, it's almost like a Monty Python sketch. Like, you're not going to like it. I'm telling you now. Like, you've got a king. His name's Yahweh. He's great. Like, you don't trust me, and they're like, no, it's going to be great. We really believe in it. It's like, okay, here's Saul, it's like, and they got a couple good ones who also had their problems. And, yeah, I mean, I think that's the messianic longing, right? Like, and that's where I think, you really can, if you want to get super theological with it, like that goes back to Genesis. It goes back to Genesis 3 and this promise that God gives Eve that, someone's going to come along to crush the serpent. And when I think it's very obvious, particularly in modernity, the last 300 years or so. It's very, very obvious that when people are feeling social disarray, cultural disarray, economic uncertainty, which part of what makes me crazy about our particular moment is the ingratitude of Americans for how good they have it. Even the ones that don't have it good, have it really good, like particularly compared to the history of the world. I'm not saying we don't have problems. Inequality is insane in this country. I'm not denying any of that. But the level of ingratitude that drives the populism in the US right now, and is driving populism around the world, it's kind of astonishing to me. And so in that moment, you're going, like who's going to save us from this mess that we're caught up in? And a guy like a Donald Trump shows up and says, "I am your retribution." Like I'm here to save you. And I think similar things happen in the church. I think similarly, lonely, disaffected, disgruntled people come along and go, "My life has no meaning. My life has no purpose. I'm not sure what any of this stuff is about." And a guy like a Mark Driscoll comes along and says, "I have a wonderful plan for your life." And it's incredibly compelling.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I can see why people, like that. One, I loved Mark Driscoll for a long time. And I'm not saying that I have like anger towards him or whatever. Again, I really appreciated the work in that podcast, and it was very eye-opening for me. And I thought you did a good job of trying to balance and try to get, him and talk about the good things as well. And but he like helped me through a time, and like when I was feeling like kind of lost and I didn't know what I was going to do. And you have someone that's up there like, "Be a man, do this, do that." And you're like, "Oh man, I do need to be a man." And you feel like you kind of feel like, "Oh man, there's this motivation." And, but then seeing how that power can corrupt is so sobering, and how it unintentionally corrupts, it's like that. You said, I love that statement. You're bankrupt slowly and then suddenly. And I would love to get your take through the research that you've been doing, through the writing of this book. Like, what do you think is really going on in the evangelical church right now? Why are we basically in such strong support of a candidate that essentially, and you can be as unfiltered or as filtered as you want, but why are we in such support of a candidate that essentially, like, if you were to put him next to Bill Clinton, we went nuts over Bill Clinton and how terrible he was, and how, and then continued to do that with the Clintons and put all of that on Hillary. And I'm not making a claim as to any specific, truth claim that was made about them and what they did. What I'm saying is that look at those two things, and essentially a guy who's now been convicted of 34 felonies, or right, Will, 34, but I've never met somebody that people will be like, "Oh, well, that's all BS." That's totally, they made that up. It's the liberal media. They all made that up. And I'm just like, I don't know, man. I have been a very outspoken, I didn't vote for Donald Trump. I did in 2016. I didn't in 2020 or 2024. I went third party in 2020 and 2024. And, I think that's lost me some friends. And I hate that, but I guess at the end I'm okay with that. It's not like I hate Donald Trump or something. I'm just like concerned about where things are going, and especially this wedding of evangelicals with power, which has been going on for a while. I just wasn't aware of it. Anyway, what do you think? I'd love to get your kind of honest, raw sense from everything. Like, what is going on here? Why did we do this? Why are we here?
Yeah, I mean, that's there's a long arc to that story. I have to say, I think the best description, the best answer to that question that I've heard was a conversation that I recorded a few weeks ago with Roger Berkowitz, who's a political theorist from Bard College. We released that on the bulletin. I think we released it. Yeah, it was the Tuesday after the election that we dropped that. So people who, if you want to hear an amazing, I mean, I asked him basically this question and he went like 20 minutes without stopping. And, I said to my producer afterwards, don't cut any of that. That was incredible what he just laid out there. So if you want to hear a better version of this, go listen to Roger. But, essentially, I think there's a couple of big factors that particularly when it comes to evangelicals supporting Trump. One of them is just the milieu as a whole. The vast majority of Trump voters are not actually evangelicals in this sense. Like when you take that, there was a number that went around for years from the 2016 election that 81 million evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. When Barna dug into those numbers and started to break it down according to church attendance, the more you went to church, the less likely you were to have actually voted for Donald Trump. So 4 times a month, churchgoers supported him at a rate that was more, I think it was more around 50% or like high 40s even maybe. And so it was more about kind of the social, cultural identification with evangelicalism. Those folks voted for him in very, very high numbers. And I think that matters. I mean, it matters in the conversation because, we still have an enormous number of Americans who are just sitting out these elections and just uninterested in politics. They're busy with other things. So, again, I think that matters. So I think for those that did vote for Trump, it's less a reflection of their evangelical identity and more a reflection of the cultural identity. I think there's a number of things that you can point to, but probably the most significant elements would be clearly one of the things Trump has done is he's tapped into a working class demographic who feels like NAFTA and the Pan-Asian trade agreements that have gone on over the last few years have greatly disadvantaged them. And that's something we've got to figure out, right? Because what we did is we set up these trade arrangements where in the U.S. we said, if you're going to manufacture in the U.S., you're going to have to conform to these safety standards and these pollution standards and these minimum wage standards and all down the line. We set it up where the American worker was really safe and really well protected. Then we opened our borders in such a way where people could literally create slave labor factories in China from which they could import those goods with no concern for worker safety, no concern for pollution, no expenses on any of that stuff, and just make stuff really, really, really dirt cheap. All our manufacturing leaves the country. The working class feels neglected and left out. That bitterness is not unjustified because there's definitely an inequality that's going on with that. The managerial class makes a lot of money from a factory overseas that's taking advantage of people. So that's the broader milieu. The specific thing that I would point to is the way the culture war unfolded under Obama. People forget that in the Obama years, not only did we get Obergefell, which most people yawned at, but a certain segment of evangelicals were very bothered by. You also had this dynamic where, because of Obamacare, you had, you had the federal government suing Hobby Lobby, suing the Little Sisters of the Poor, like suing nuns because they don't want to take birth control, they don't want to pay for it. That was jacked up. Like that was terrible, and people were embittered by that. What the Republican Party then does, first they nominate Mitt Romney, who the media did a great job of kind of painting him as this rich elitist who, killed grandmas and drove around with dogs on the roof of his car. It was just this sort of callous. It was just an absurd caricature of the guy. But he didn't do himself favors. He didn't break that image. And so he failed in his campaign in that way. And so not only did Democrats peg him that way, but embittered Republican voters saw him as elite and out of touch and of a class that didn't care about them and their concerns. He was saying corporations are people too, right? Like that was a terrible line, and it really, I think it really tanked his campaign far more than he realized. And then I think so then 2016 comes around, and everybody in the Republican establishment, if you talk to them at the time, they're all saying it's Rubio's year. This is the year the party changes. We're going to get change. We're going to get this young Latino reformicon who's going to come in, and he already had some, interesting things to say about trade. He was a hawk. It's going to be Rubio. Don't worry about Trump. Don't worry about Cruz. It'll be flash in the pan. By the time we get to the third or fourth primary, be very clear that it's Rubio. And of course, it was not Rubio. And what Trump did is he tapped into that spirit of grievance, that spirit of these out-of-touch elites don't care about us, and I do, and I'm going to go fight for you, and I'm going to go fight for your jobs, and I'm going to fight for your safety, and I'm going to make sure that the church is safe, and all the circumstances that have caused anxiety, I'm going to address for you. He spoke to all that, and he spoke to it incredibly effectively, and yeah, I think that's why he won. That's why he won again. And if Vance taps into that, grievance in the future, Vance has a chance of election in 4 years.
And he will tap into that. Yeah. I don't have any doubt.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, I am kind of curious. So the first person we spoke with after the election was Sam Perry. And I always enjoy talking to Sam Perry. He's got a lot of great insight about.
Yeah, I love Sam.
And one of the questions I had asked him, and I'm curious. I'm going to ask you the exact same question. Is like, do we need like different titles for Christians or evangelicals or something like that? Because it seems like the term has been somewhat hijacked. Because like I was just thinking about this. I was catching up on news this morning, reading about, Bibles making their way into classrooms and all kinds of stuff. And I was thinking, just based on my own kind of history, talking to a lot of evangelicals that have a hard time believing, Democrats can be Christians. It's like would you want somebody like me teaching the Bible in one of these classrooms? Like, probably not. Like, I mean, not that I couldn't. I mean, I did flirt for a time as a youth pastor, but would you want a progressive like me teaching about how Jesus wants people just to love each other, like not to hate, blah, blah, blah. And my guess is the answer would be no. So I'm curious, what do you think about, the terms we use? Elon considers himself a cultural Christian. So like just kind of the good feely part, none of the accountability stuff. So like, I love just get your take on how do you wade through when people say they're a Christian, like all the sort of things that get attached to what that means, back in the day and today.
Yeah. It reminds me, it actually reminds me of this moment in the 2008 election that I thought was really profound. At a debate, someone asked McCain and Obama to, what does your faith mean to you? And McCain goes first, and he tells a story about being in the Hanoi Hilton. And, they had like a yard. They'd get a couple hours of sunlight a day or a couple minutes of sunlight a day or whatever. And it was Christmas Day, and you weren't allowed to talk to each other. And he sees another prisoner and walks over to him, and the guy carves an ichthus into the dirt with his foot. And he said, my faith, to me, it was a light, it was a hope, it moved me forward. And
just real fast, Mike, can you explain what an ichthus is for our audience?
Yeah, it's like that fish symbol that you see on the backs of cars, right? And so the Hanoi Hilton, like, this is when John McCain was in prison in Vietnam, when he was a prisoner of war in Vietnam, and it's a touching story. It's a powerful story. It doesn't tell us a whole lot about McCain's faith, right? It doesn't tell us exactly like what does he mean by that. It's again, it's a beautiful story on its own right, but it doesn't tell us very much. Then Obama was asked the same question, and Obama basically gives him the Romans road. I mean, it's on YouTube. You should go watch it, because Obama basically says, well, I believe that Jesus was the Son of God, and he lived a perfect life, and he died on the cross to forgive us of our sins so that we can be reconciled to God and to one another. And I'm like, amen, brother. Like, where's the aisle? I'll walk it, And that makes a ton of sense. I mean, Obama really grew up in Christianity. He was really immersed in the church in Chicago. Yes, it was a progressive church, but it was a progressive black church where they still preach the Bible a lot in progressive black churches. And so of course he was able to articulate the gospel in a coherent way. And yet, throughout that campaign and afterwards, you still had this thing of, how could you be a Democrat and be a Christian? And I think that's I think it's just an absurd set of categories. Like the moral calculus of how people discern their politics is a very complicated and difficult thing. To make the vote or the party alliance a litmus test is just absurd. It always was absurd, is my point, because it's especially absurd now to make it a litmus test because we're so ill represented by either party. But it was definitely it was absurd a long time ago as well. The last conversation I had with Tim Keller before he passed, Tim said that he had spent his final, or he had spent the previous several months reading everything written by the founders of the fundamentalist movement and everything written by the founders of the neo-evangelical movement. And he said the parallels between the two of them were striking. They were dealing with the same pressures, and it's so similar to where we are today. And I think what Keller, he said, I think there's going to come a breaking point where the alliances don't work anymore and the language doesn't work anymore. Because what does it mean when you say evangelical? Well, it depends on your context. If it's on Fox News, you're just talking about a demographic. If it's, at a theological conference, it means something very, very specific, which is what it was always supposed to mean. That goes back a long time too, though. I mean, people were talking about evangelical voters in the 2004 election, and it didn't really even refer to church-going people. I mean, all the way back then, you can look at it, and if you looked inside the tabs on the the polling, when they would refer to evangelicals, it included Catholics, it included like religious Muslims, and some of them included Muslims in the group, because they were just talking about like social conservatism. And I think there's probably something to be said for abandoning the term in the years ahead.
Yeah, I really like that. I agree. It's like it has definitely become just a very ambiguous term, but that is used so much with so many assumptions behind it that it's literally impossible for someone to say, well, I'm an evangelical. Not impossible. Obviously, people say that all the time. But what I mean, the impossibility that I was referring to is like knowing what they mean by that just by them saying it.
Right.
As opposed to having to dig a little bit more and ask more questions about, you're no longer safe to make those assumptions.
Yep. for sure.
And this is the last really major kind of question that we have, but I'm curious as to what are you hoping that this book accomplishes, and with that, I know a lot of your work is going into this, this kind of theme and the stream of trying to kind of help wake up the church in America to look at itself in a mirror, right? And then try to take these steps to become more like Jesus or get back to roots or whatever it is. You could speak on that for sure. But what are you hopeful for in all of the work that you're doing? And what are you most concerned about? And you can answer those in either order.
Yeah. I think what I'm hopeful for is a church that, it was funny. Someone who reviewed the book made the comment that my fundamental argument is to let God be God, and for the church to be smaller. And I'm like, man, they said that way better than I did, because that's so what I am about. I think that we do live in this time, and I really do think this idea of mass loneliness that Arendt talks so much about is kind of the key to understanding all of this. We do live in this time of atomization and loneliness and isolation, and because of that, it gives an awful lot of power to political movements, cults, charismatic leaders of various kinds. And my hope is that the church finds a way to tell a bigger and a better story that's not rooted in an individual or a single institution, but is rooted in God, is rooted in a bigger, more beautiful story than any of that. A story that can outlast its participants, because that's what the church is. It's something that's been here before us. It's going to be here after us. And it's going to be here until the day Jesus comes back to restore all things. Finding a way to tell that story again, which and what I love about it is that it comes back to, renewal of, probably a grassroots renewal of worship and liturgy and the practices of faith, and I think the arts have a role to play in all of this. For that to happen, it's going to have to be a movement of the Spirit, and the church is going to have to learn how to pray again. And I don't know that we're good at that in this time. What I'm afraid of is, how's Lauryn Hill put it? Every action has an equal opposite reaction, right? There's I think with Trump when Trump came in 2016, we got the squad in 2018. And by 2020, things were nuts in this country. And the division was so wild. You had riots all summer and then a riot on the Capitol. Lots of people were expecting riots if Trump won this year. I was not particularly expecting riots if Trump won this year. I think we'll have riots in 2 years with Trump coming in, because I think already what he's done with some of these appointments, some of them are just so morally egregious that if Gates gets confirmed, which I'm betting he does, because why would we think that the Senate suddenly found its spine and courage? I expect Gates to get confirmed, and as a result, if he goes into the AG's office and if he weaponizes it the way he's promising to, that will spike very, very ugly things in the streets, and I'm afraid of that. I think political violence is terrible, and I'm worried about us where we go.
So on that happy note, Mike, Where can people find more of your optimism and rainbows and unicorns?
Yeah. You can find me I'm on Twitter at Mike Cosper. I'm on Instagram. I think I'm Mike D. Cosper on Instagram. I'm on the Bulletin every week, and have me back here. I'll come back anytime.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mike. This was a really, really fun conversation.
Yeah, it really was.
And
I appreciate it.
Thank you for all the work that you do at Christianity Today and continue to do, and to our audience and listeners. Thanks for stopping by and joining us. And remember, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. And we'll see you next time. Take care. Bye.
Hey there, Josh Bertram here, faithful host of the Faithful Politics Podcast. I want to let you know about a compelling new spinoff, the Faith Roundtable, where I'll be interviewing top faith leaders, theologians, and scholars to unpack the pressing issues that are shaping the church in America today. We'll dive into topics like faith in public life, social justice, and how we can engage our communities more effectively. Make sure you don't miss any of our enlightening conversations by subscribing to it on our YouTube channel. Join me at the Faith Roundtable, where deep discussion meets thoughtful insight.